I hid my $11 million. Before the ICU, good thing I did, my kids came with a Notar. Eleanor Hawthorne was not dead. Not yet. But the moment she opened her eyes to the sterile white light of the ICU, something inside her told her a part of her life had already been buried. The beep of the monitor was steady, almost too calm for what was happening. Her mouth was dry, her throat sore from the breathing tube they must have removed hours earlier. Tubes ran down both arms, oxygen still clipped at her nose, but that wasn't what made her heart clench. It was the voices. They were low, composed, and far too familiar. "She still has control over everything," said a man's voice. Malcolm, her eldest. "We need to move now before she gets better." "She can't even speak, Mal," another voice chimed in. Heather, her daughter, always the practical one. "Just get her to sign, a few initials and it's done." Then came Rachel, the quiet one. Soft, but firm in moments that needed nerve. "Just tell her it's for peace of mind. She doesn't need to worry." Eleanor tried to move her fingers. They felt like wet clay. She could barely lift them, but she managed to feel the slight weight of something cold and metallic, a pen, being placed into her right hand. "She's awake," Rachel whispered. But no one looked into her eyes. No one asked if she understood. They assumed she couldn't. "Just a signature, Mom. That's all. It'll help." They spoke with the hollow calm of people finalizing a will, not sitting beside a woman who had raised them. It wasn't the betrayal that struck her first. It was the precision, the planning, the way they didn't flinch. A notary stood silently near the foot of the bed, a man in a charcoal suit with a briefcase and papers fanned out neatly on a clipboard. Eleanor let the pen slip. It rolled off the edge of the blanket and clinked softly onto the linoleum floor. For a moment, no one moved. Then Malcolm let out a breath sharp enough to fog glass. "She's impossible," he muttered, walking away. Heather picked up the pen. Rachel followed, head slightly bowed. And just like that, they left. The notary trailed behind, not a word spoken. Eleanor's gaze lingered on the door as it clicked shut. She had always known something like this might happen, not in a dramatic, paranoid way, but in that subtle, aching way mothers sometimes sense their own erosion in the eyes of their children. She remembered changing diapers, staying up through teething nights, putting bandages on scraped knees. The countless birthday parties, the late-night phone calls, the college tuition payments. It had all blurred into one truth. They had come into her world with open hands, and now they had returned with empty hearts. She closed her eyes, not to sleep, but to remember. Her home in Vermont had once been filled with light and laughter. The lakeside retreat she built from the ground up, Rosewood Glen, had been a sanctuary for grieving women, a healing place for those who had lost partners, siblings, or themselves. Over the years, she had walked beside hundreds of women learning how to live again. Widows, caregivers, survivors. They came broken. They left braver. And yet, despite the lives she helped mend, her own family, her own children, stood in a hospital room and tried to erase her with a signature. They thought they were being clever, catching her weak, catching her helpless. But what they didn't know, what they would never know, was that Eleanor had already seen them coming. She had made a decision a month ago, a quiet, irreversible decision. She just hadn't told anyone. That moment in the ICU wasn't the beginning of betrayal. It was simply the confirmation that her legacy was never safe in the hands of those who saw it as property. A nurse entered quietly, checking her vitals, oblivious to the scene that had just unfolded. Eleanor didn't speak. Not yet. Her throat still ached, and her thoughts were louder than her voice. But inside, a calm began to build. Not revenge, Not rage, just resolve. She would not be signed away. Not her name, not her land, not her story. They had tried to finish a chapter that wasn't theirs to write, and now, Eleanor would make sure she finished it herself. A month earlier, Eleanor had stood barefoot on the wraparound porch of her lakeside home in rural Vermont, cradling a chipped ceramic mug in her hand. It was nearly dusk, and the water beyond the trees shimmered with that gentle amber hue only early autumn could paint. She had seen this view for nearly 3 decades, but that evening it felt unfamiliar, like standing in someone else's memory. The house was quiet. Too quiet. The usual clatter of teaspoons or the hum of the old radio in the kitchen had gone still. The retreat had closed early for the weekend. The women who had come for healing had left tearful and grateful, promising to write. And Eleanor, for the first time in years, found herself alone with a strange sensation in her chest. Not sadness, not joy, but a kind of gnawing truth. Her children had visited 2 weeks ago. They came in polished cars with pre-written smiles. Malcolm had brought his latest proposal, an idea to modernize the brand and turn Rosewood Glen into a luxury wellness spa. Heather had slipped brochures into the kitchen drawer with a knowing glance. Rachel, as usual, said little, but kept glancing at the family portrait on the mantel. Not with nostalgia. Eleanor knew that look. It was calculation. Later that night, after they'd all gone, she had gone up to the attic and opened a dusty trunk where she kept old letters, journals, and photographs. In the middle of it all was a small folder labeled Private E.H. Inside were the early blueprints for the retreat, handwritten mission statements, even her first grant application. She ran her fingers along the yellowing paper and felt something deep inside her, an ache older than arthritis. This place wasn't a business. It was a promise. Eleanor hadn't built Rosewood Glen with profit in mind. It started as a single cabin and a dream, after losing her husband to cancer when she was just 51. He was the love of her life, a gentle man who never raised his voice and always knew when to pour the tea. His loss had hollowed her out. And in that hollow space, she built something for others who knew that same ache. Over the years, the retreat grew. Volunteers came, then donors, then a full-time team. It became a refuge, a beacon. But to Malcolm, it was a portfolio opportunity. To Heather, a legacy rebrand. And to Rachel, maybe just a burden too heavy to carry. Eleanor knew the signs, the subtle silences, the way they asked if she'd updated her will. The suggestion, offhand, almost polite, that she should delegate more. Delegate to whom? To those who saw her sanctuary as a stock to flip? That's when the clarity arrived, not as a thunderclap, but as a whisper. Protect it, not just from outsiders, but from the ones closest to her. She didn't sleep that night. Instead, she emailed Belinda, her closest friend and director of care at the retreat. Coffee tomorrow? Urgent. They met the next morning in the quiet sunroom behind the chapel building. Belinda arrived with 2 thermoses and a knowing expression. She didn't ask why. She just listened. "I want to do something permanent," Eleanor had said, her voice steady but soft. "I need to make sure this place lasts beyond me. Not for them. Not in their hands." Belinda had nodded slowly, then reached into her tote and pulled out a legal pad. "I know a lawyer," she said. "Trusts, nonprofits, all of it. We can start today." That same afternoon they began drafting paperwork. Eleanor would establish a new foundation, the Hawthorne Heart Trust, which would assume full ownership and stewardship of Rosewood Glen. Its board would be comprised of former retreat residents, grief counselors, and community leaders. Not family, not heirs. This wasn't about punishment. It was about purpose. For a week, Eleanor worked with the attorney, crossing T's and rewording clauses. She read everything, twice. She signed every document with her own hand, in full consciousness, in full clarity. By the time the paperwork was filed, Rosewood Glen no longer legally belonged to Eleanor Hawthorne, and thank God it didn't. Because what happened next would have broken her, if she hadn't already made that choice. On a chilly Sunday morning, just 1 week after the final transfer, Eleanor felt short of breath climbing the stairs to her bedroom. She thought it was just fatigue, maybe a cold, but the tightness in her chest didn't ease. It worsened. She tried to call Belinda but collapsed before the phone even rang. The neighbor's dog found her, howling through the open back screen door until someone came to check. The ambulance arrived in minutes. The hospital was 30 miles away, but they got her there fast enough to avoid a full cardiac arrest. She drifted in and out of consciousness for the next 2 days. And when she finally opened her eyes in the ICU, her children were already standing over her. Not with flowers, but with documents and a pen. That September evening, when Eleanor had begun drafting the first emails for the trust, the air outside was unusually still. Not the kind of stillness that soothes, but the kind that warns. Inside her home, the lights were dimmed low. The kitchen smelled faintly of cloves and burnt toast from a breakfast she hadn't eaten. Eleanor sat at the long oak dining table, laptop open in front of her, staring at a blank email draft with only 2 typed words. Widow's Trust. She deleted the phrase. Too obvious, too somber. This wasn't just about widows. This was about women who had survived. Grief, abandonment, illness, loneliness. It was about giving what she had built back to the people who had given it meaning. She placed her fingers back on the keys. Subject line, "The heart knows when to let go body." I am ready to protect something sacred. I know now I can't take it with me, but I can choose who gets to hold it next. It wasn't eloquent. It wasn't final. But it was real. She saved the draft and closed the lid of her laptop. The following morning, Eleanor met with Belinda at a modest little cafe on the edge of town, Maple and Steam. The kind of place where you didn't have to say much to be heard. The waitress, a young woman with a bun high on her head and kindness in her eyes, brought them chamomile tea without being asked. Eleanor didn't waste time. "I want it out of my name," she said, barely above a whisper. Belinda gave a slow nod. She didn't look surprised. If anything, she looked relieved. "You've been carrying it too long." They discussed everything: the legal logistics, the foundation's mission, the board selection. Eleanor wanted no loopholes, no inheritance rights, no controlling interest to any of her children. Not because she didn't love them, but because she didn't trust them. That distinction hurt, but it was honest. Belinda helped her assemble a team. An attorney named Nora, soft-spoken but razor-sharp. An accountant who had once worked for a community clinic and knew how to sniff out misuse before it began. And most importantly, a woman named Lila, a former guest of the retreat, now a grief counselor, who had once told Eleanor that Rosewood Glen saved her life. Eleanor wanted her voice at the table. Within 10 days, they had outlined the entire trust structure. Eleanor would step down as sole owner and founder and transition to honorary board advisor. The retreat's property, assets, and mission would all fall under the Hawthorne Heart Trust, protected by a charter that ensured public benefit over private gain. On the day she signed the documents, the lawyer offered her a private room. "Take your time," Nora had said, placing the file gently on a cedarwood desk. Eleanor ran her fingers across the pages. There was a tremble in her hand, but not from doubt. It was the tremble of release. The way a mother finally exhales when her child makes it home safely. She signed everything with a fountain pen. Full name, full date. As she finished the last signature, The power went out for a brief moment, just a flicker, but enough to startle her. When the lights came back on, Nora returned, collected the folder, and looked at Eleanor with a curious softness. "You've done something very rare," she said. Eleanor smiled, tired. "I've done what I should have done years ago." That night, Eleanor returned to her quiet house. The porch creaked beneath her steps. The scent of pine was heavier than usual. Fall was arriving, slow and certain. She boiled a pot of water for tea and sat by the window overlooking the water. She didn't journal. She didn't cry. She simply watched the sky fade from rose to slate. The stillness returned, but this time it didn't frighten her. She was at peace. 3 days later, Rachel called. "Hey, Mom," she said lightly. "Heather's thinking of bringing the boys up next weekend. Malcolm's got this investor thing in Montreal, but might stop by too." There it was again, that carefully timed coordination, the kind that arrived just a bit too often after Eleanor's birthday, or after she'd mentioned health checkups. "That's nice," Eleanor replied. "I might be away, or resting." "Oh," Rachel said, caught off guard. "Are you okay?" "I'm more than okay," Eleanor said. "I'm preparing for something good." It was true. She wasn't sure what would happen next, but for once she wasn't preparing for battle. She was preparing for protection, the kind that doesn't guard out of fear, but out of love for what matters. That night, Eleanor drafted a short letter to Belinda and the board-to-be. It wasn't formal. It was personal. "If you're reading this, then it means everything's been filed. Thank you. Not just for helping me let go of something precious, but for helping me make sure it's never misused. I don't want my name engraved in any walls. Just make sure no one is ever turned away because they don't wear the right shoes, or they cry too loudly in the garden, or they ask for seconds at lunch. Let this place remain sacred, not because I founded it, but because we kept it free from greed. Love, Eleanor." She folded the letter and sealed it in a manila envelope marked private. Then she slid it under her mattress. And when she collapsed a week later in the hallway between the bedroom and the guest bathroom, that envelope remained exactly where she left it, quiet, unseen, and powerful. Eleanor had always believed that the strongest decisions were made in silence, those midnight choices that came not from impulse, but from clarity. And the decision to transfer the entirety of Rosewood Glen into the Hawthorne Heart Trust was one such moment. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't vindictive. It was simply inevitable. She remembered the day she first walked the land that would become the retreat. Just a sloped patch of overgrown weeds and a rusted shed at the edge of a lake. The real estate agent had apologized profusely for showing it to her, but Eleanor had stepped out of the car, smelled the pine in the air, and felt something ancient in her chest shift into place. She didn't see a broken plot of land. She saw sanctuary. And now, 30 years later, she was giving it back to the kind of people it was built for. The final transfer came on a gray Tuesday afternoon. Eleanor arrived at the law office in a wool coat she had worn since the early 2000s. She liked it because it had deep pockets, the kind that could hold everything you needed and nothing you didn't. Inside one of those pockets was the original sketch of the Rosewood Glen logo, hand-drawn on a napkin by a former guest named Linda. A simple outline of a house tucked into the curve of a heart. Eleanor had always meant to make it official, but it stayed on paper, soft, imperfect, real. At the lawyer's office, Nora greeted her with a smile and a sealed folder. "It's ready," she said. "You just need to sign the last page and initial the addendum." Eleanor took her time reading each section again. Even though she knew the documents by heart, she wanted to feel the weight of each word. The trust was irrevocable. The land, buildings, funds, and future programming would be managed by a nonprofit board made up of community representatives and former retreat members. No familial appointments permitted. No inheritance allowed. She signed her name, slowly, carefully. And when she put the pen down, she sat for a long moment with her hands folded. "It's done," Nora said gently. "Yes," Eleanor whispered. "And I'm still here." The following morning, she took a long walk through the retreat grounds. The gravel paths were damp from the night's drizzle, and the garden beds were just beginning to wilt for the season. She passed the old meditation gazebo by the maple trees, now worn smooth by years of quiet tears and whispered confessions. She placed her hand on one of the beams and closed her eyes. "This is yours now," she whispered, not to a person, but to the space itself. "Stay kind. Stay open." Inside the main building, the staff was busy preparing for a weekend workshop. Belinda was in the kitchen, sorting packets of tea and laughing with Lila about whether they had ordered enough blankets. Eleanor didn't interrupt. She just watched. It felt strange to witness something she had built move on without her. But it also felt right. She had one more task to complete that day, making copies of the signed documents and securing them. Back home, she opened the safe in the guest bedroom. Inside were her husband's old journals, a deed to the house, and now, carefully slid into a new fireproof envelope, the original trust agreement, stamped and sealed. She labeled it in her own handwriting. Rosewood Glen, Final Transfer, 2025. Then she tucked another copy into a locked cabinet in her study and backed up the digital version onto a secure cloud folder with two-step verification. Finally, she sent one email to Belinda, no subject line, no greeting. Just one attachment and a short note. "Everything is now protected. If anything happens to me, do not let them near this place. E." She felt no fear, just readiness. That night, Eleanor sat on the porch with a wool blanket draped across her legs and a thermos of spiced cider. The wind carried hints of pine and smoke, and for the first time in months, her chest felt lighter. She had always thought peace would come from having things in order. Now she realized it came from letting go of what no longer belonged to her. But peace is a fragile thing. And by the time the first frost dusted the lawn, Eleanor's health began to shift again. At first, it was small things. Forgetting the tea kettle on the stove, taking longer to climb stairs, falling asleep during her favorite radio program. Then came the shortness of breath. The tightness in her chest when she leaned down to tie her boots. She ignored it at first, brushed it off. Just aging, she told herself, just fatigue. But deep down, a quiet voice warned her, something is coming. Still, she didn't go to the doctor. She made soup instead, watered the plants, folded laundry with deliberate care. Until the morning she collapsed, without warning, somewhere between her hallway and the guest bathroom. No dramatic fall, no cry for help, just stillness. The neighbor's dog barked endlessly at the back door until someone came to investigate. That dog may have saved her life. The ambulance arrived swiftly. The EMTs were kind, quick, and quiet. They didn't know she had just signed away a legacy. They only saw a frail woman who had stopped breathing for just long enough to make them work harder. At the hospital, machines took over. Monitors beeped, IVs dripped, paperwork shuffled. And then, her children were notified. Malcolm, Heather, Rachel, 3 children who hadn't heard a word about the trust. 3 children who still believed Eleanor owned everything. And 3 children who, less than a day later, would walk into her ICU room with a folder, a notary, and a pen. The hallway outside Eleanor's ICU room smelled like antiseptic and stale coffee. Nurses moved briskly from station to station, carts squeaked, and monitors beeped in rhythm. Yet inside room 407, time seemed to fold in on itself. Eleanor lay motionless, her eyes closed, her breathing shallow but steady. She looked like sleep had taken her gently, like someone resting after a long day's work. But inside, her body was at war. Her lungs fought for rhythm, her heart for balance. The cardiologist had called it a warning. One more missed signal, and it would have been a full cardiac event. She wasn't awake when Malcolm arrived. He came alone at first, walking quickly, his steps sharp and intentional. He didn't stop at the nurse's desk. He didn't ask questions. He went straight to her room and stood at the foot of the bed like a man taking inventory. Later that morning, Heather showed up. Impeccably dressed, her hair pulled into a low bun, her handbag pristine. Rachel followed half an hour after, no makeup, quiet sneakers, a bottle of lemon water in hand. She always tried to look gentle. It was her armor. By noon, they were seated together in the room, speaking in hushed voices, as if Eleanor couldn't hear. But her ears worked just fine. Her eyelids fluttered occasionally. Her fingers twitched against the blanket. "They said she's stable but sedated," Malcolm said, flipping through a folder in his lap. "If we wait too long, we'll need another round of approvals. The lawyer said today is our window." Heather nodded without emotion. "We'll keep it minimal. A durable power of attorney, financial transfer authority, maybe a medical directive. Nothing she hasn't signed before." Rachel hesitated. "What if she wakes up?" Malcolm didn't look up. "Then we remind her it's for peace of mind." Eleanor's mind sharpened like a knife. They weren't here for comfort. They were here for control. And yet, she wasn't afraid. She'd already done the thing they feared most. She had let go. She listened as the door opened again and a new set of footsteps entered. This pair was heavier, more measured. Then came the unmistakable sound of a briefcase latching open. A notary. Eleanor felt a cool pressure on her hand, fingers lifting her wrist, a pen being slid between her fingers. "She doesn't need to grip it hard," Heather murmured. "Just close her hand around it." Rachel leaned closer. "Mom? Just a quick signature. You don't have to worry. We'll take care of everything." No one looked at her face. No one asked if she understood. They thought she was gone enough to comply, but not gone enough to void the documents. Her hand stayed limp. The pen dropped, rolled once, and settled against the crease in the blanket. Malcolm made a sound that was half sigh, half groan. "She's being difficult, as usual." Heather bent to retrieve the pen, but this time Eleanor's fingers twitched, a small, defiant curl, barely visible but enough to make Heather pause. "She's conscious," Rachel whispered. Malcolm turned sharply, meeting his mother's gaze for the first time. Eleanor didn't speak. Her throat was too dry, her lungs still aching, but her eyes were wide open, and they were not confused. They were fierce. For a long second, no one said anything. Then Malcolm turned away, adjusting the cuffs of his shirt like he was brushing off the moment. "She doesn't know what she's doing," he muttered. Heather stepped back, clearly flustered. Rachel looked down, visibly shaken. The notary remained silent, closing his briefcase and nodding once, perhaps recognizing the ethics breach he had just participated in. They left in silence. Malcolm first, then Heather, and finally Rachel, who paused just a moment longer and whispered, "I'm sorry," before slipping through the door. Eleanor closed her eyes, not because she was tired, but because she needed the stillness. Not to process shock, but to ground herself again in clarity. What had just happened was worse than she feared. Not the attempt itself, but the ease of it. The way her children had orchestrated it like a business meeting. The complete absence of tenderness, the absence of her. They didn't see their mother lying in that bed. They saw a signature. a gatekeeper to wealth, an obstacle. The next morning, a nurse named Mari helped Eleanor sit up for the first time. "You gave us quite a scare," she said kindly, placing a pillow behind her back. "But you're tougher than you look." Eleanor smiled weakly. Her voice came out raspy. "I always have been." Marie poured her a small glass of water. "Want to try sipping?" Eleanor took it with shaking fingers and drank slowly. Later that afternoon, Belinda arrived. She brought tea from the cafe downstairs, along with a pair of Eleanor's slippers and a cardigan from the retreat. "You're awake," she breathed, her voice cracking just slightly. "Thank God." Leonard didn't say much at first. She just nodded, let her friend place the blanket around her shoulders, and accepted the tea. "They came," she said after a long pause. Belinda didn't need to ask who. "I figured," she said softly. "One of the nurses said a man brought legal documents yesterday." "Not just one," Eleanor whispered. "All three of them, and a notary." Belinda's face darkened. "They tried to take everything." Eleanor nodded. "But they didn't," she added, "because I already gave it away." Belinda took her hand. "You did the right thing," she said, "and now it's protected." For the first time in days, Eleanor felt warmth return, not just to her limbs, but to her spirit. She may have been weak in body, but her voice, her will, her story was intact, and that was more powerful than any signature could ever be. Eleanor's recovery wasn't dramatic. There was no teary miracle, no speech from the doctors proclaiming her a medical marvel. It was slow, uneven, a battle fought in inches, but every inch mattered. By the third morning in the ICU, the breathing tubes had been removed, her vitals had stabilized, and the nurses began encouraging her to sit upright in bed. Even that simple motion felt like climbing a mountain. Her muscles ached, her skin was pale and loose, and every breath burned a little, like her body was relearning how to exist. But she was lucid, and more importantly, she remembered. She remembered the cold weight of the pen in her hand. She remembered Rachel's breath against her cheek whispering, "Just sign." She remembered Malcolm's impatience, Heather's rehearsed tone, the notary's silence. And she remembered not signing. She had said no, not with her voice, but with her refusal to grip the pen. And that, in the end, was louder than words. Later that day, a nurse brought her a small canvas bag. "Your personal items," she said kindly, placing it on the rolling tray. Inside were her reading glasses, her favorite hand lotion, a soft scarf someone had packed, and most importantly, her phone. Her hands trembled as she scrolled through the screen, tapping her passcode slowly. Dozens of missed calls and unread messages blinked at her. She ignored them all. Instead, she opened the Notes app and typed slowly, October 12th. ICU. Malcolm brought a notary, tried to coerce signature. Heather and Rachel assisted. No consent. No prior discussion. Witness? Notary in dark suit, early 40s, Caucasian, black leather briefcase. Heard them say, "Just need a signature before she gets better." She backed up the file to the cloud and then emailed a copy to Belinda with no message. Just the attachment. She leaned back into the pillows and closed her eyes. It had begun. The unraveling, the resistance, the reclamation. By Thursday, Eleanor was transferred from the ICU to a standard recovery room. The heart monitor was still clipped to her chest, but she no longer needed constant oxygen. Her body was weak, but her mind was sharp, perhaps sharper than it had been in years. Belinda visited again, bringing with her a soft gray cardigan and a thermos of chamomile tea. "You look better already," she said with a tired smile. Eleanor nodded. Because I'm angry. Belinda raised a brow. Anger keeps the blood flowing, Eleanor added. They both chuckled, and for a moment it felt like nothing had changed, but everything had. Malcolm had called the retreat office. He'd told the receptionist that, given Eleanor's condition, he would now be stepping in to handle operations. He said you gave verbal consent, Belinda said flatly. Eleanor narrowed her eyes. Of course he did. She didn't need to ask whether the staff had believed him. Belinda's presence said enough. The retreat was in safe hands, for now. But Eleanor knew that wasn't enough. Her children had crossed a line. And once crossed, some lines never returned to where they began. That night, Eleanor asked the nurse to bring her the canvas bag again. She pulled out her phone and reviewed the scanned trust documents she had saved weeks ago. Everything was still there. The notarized transfer, the certificate of foundation status, and the board member declarations. She read them slowly, reminding herself she hadn't imagined it. She had already won the battle they were just beginning to wage. The next morning, Eleanor was strong enough to stand with assistance. A young physical therapist named Casey helped her move to a chair by the window. The view was nothing special, a rooftop parking lot, the gray sprawl of hospital HVAC units, but Eleanor looked past it, toward the sky, the edges of the mountains beyond. First walk soon, Casey said, even just a few steps. Eleanor nodded. I need to get home. Casey grinned. Spoken like a true escape artist. She chuckled softly. Number spoken like someone with a fireproof safe in her closet and people who don't know it exists. He blinked. Fair enough. Back at home, the silence had weight. When she was finally discharged 3 days later, Belinda drove her back, careful over every bump in the road. Eleanor didn't speak much during the drive. Her body was exhausted, but her mind kept racing ahead. When they arrived, the house greeted her like an old friend. Not warmly, but respectfully. It was different now. The silence wasn't comforting. It was expectant. She went straight to the guest bedroom, opened the closet, and knelt beside the safe. Her fingers moved slowly over the dial, and when the latch clicked open, she sighed with relief. Inside, everything was untouched. The trust documents, the board confirmations, the letters to Belinda and the foundation. She photographed each page again, just to be sure. Then she placed them into a new, smaller fireproof lockbox, which she installed in her bedroom wall. Only 2 people knew about it, Eleanor and her attorney Nora. The next day, her phone vibrated with 3 messages. Heather. Hope you're getting some rest. Let us know when we can stop by. Malcolm. We should talk. This weekend? Rachel. Nothing. As usual. Eleanor didn't reply. Instead, she made a list in her journal. Change power of attorney. Remove emergency contacts. Update medical directive. Notify retreat board of impersonation. Install exterior cameras. Secure passwords. She paused, then added one more. Remember, they already tried. And they failed. Eleanor wasn't naive. She knew this wasn't over. People don't let go of money easily, especially when they think it's theirs. But she also knew something else now. She had looked at each of her children, one by one, in the room where she was supposed to be dying, and she had seen them clearly for the first time. Not as her babies, not as her hopes, but as adults with choices. And they had made theirs. Now, she would make hers. Eleanor's world had narrowed to 2 priorities: protect the truth and protect her peace. The hospital had nearly taken both. Her days now began slowly, each breath a reminder that life had not abandoned her. Mornings started with warm tea on the sun porch and the soft chirp of birds outside the window. The chill of autumn had deepened, and the lake's surface shimmered like glass. The kind of stillness that looks peaceful until you remember what lies beneath. Her phone rarely rang, but on Monday morning, it did. Unknown number. She hesitated, then answered. Ms. Hawthorne. This is Clara from the Addison County Probate Court. I'm calling to inform you that a petition has been filed regarding your guardianship. Eleanor closed her eyes slowly. I see. Filed by Malcolm Hawthorne, citing concern over your recent health episode and alleged erratic decisions regarding your estate. His siblings, Heather and Rachel, are listed as supporting parties. Eleanor didn't speak. Not yet. There will be a hearing in 2 weeks, Clara continued. We'll mail the documents today. You're entitled to legal representation. Thank you, Eleanor said softly. I'll be ready. When she hung up, her hand trembled. Not from surprise, but from the bitter ache of confirmation. They were not done. They hadn't seen her survival as a blessing, but an inconvenience. She called Nora, her attorney. I expected this, Nora said calmly. We'll respond immediately. This is not a crisis, it's a process. I don't want this to become a public spectacle, Eleanor said. It won't, Nora reassured her. But I need everything. The hospital reports, your journal notes, the email to Belinda, the notary's visit. Every detail. Eleanor spent the next hour gathering it all. She printed her digital notes, copied the security camera footage from the retreat showing Malcolm trying to enter the main office without authorization, and wrote a detailed account of the ICU incident in her own handwriting, each word slow and deliberate. By the end of the day, Nora had a full file. This isn't just a defense, she told Eleanor. This is a pattern, and judges don't like patterns like this. Eleanor nodded. She didn't need revenge. She needed recognition. From someone impartial, someone with authority. Because for the first time in her life, her own children were trying to legally erase her. Over the next few days, Eleanor focused on recovery. She followed the doctor's orders, wore her heart monitor, and walked laps around her kitchen each morning. Her strength grew slowly, but her clarity was unwavering. The retreat board was notified. Belinda gathered the staff and explained the situation in calm, clear language. There may be attempts to contact you, or even show up in person, Belinda told them. You're not to engage. Forward everything to me. Eleanor is still very much alive, and very much in charge of her own story. Eleanor drafted a message for the board. No decisions are to be made by family members. All inquiries must go through the board. The foundation structure is final, binding, and protected by law. Let them try. They'll find nothing but the truth. She hit send, then turned off her phone for the rest of the evening. That night, as she stirred lentils and chopped sweet potatoes, Eleanor thought of how many years she had spent cooking for others. For the kids when they were small, for volunteers at the retreat, for the women who arrived too fragile to eat, but eventually asked for seconds. Tonight's meal was for no one but herself. No audience, no guests, just the quiet company of her own resolve. The following Saturday, the doorbell rang. She didn't answer it. She looked through the peephole. Rachel. Standing on the porch with a tray of banana bread and her sweatshirt sleeves pulled over her palms like she used to as a teenager. She waited there for almost a minute, rocking slightly on her heels. Then she turned and left. Eleanor didn't move until the car disappeared down the road. Then she wrote in her journal, "They are not the same people I raised, but I am not the same woman who once opened the door to anyone with sad eyes and a smile. I am rebuilding. With silence, with truth, and with steel where there used to be soft things." On Monday morning, Nora called with an update. "The judge has reviewed the initial petition," she said. "She's flagged it for further scrutiny. That's a good sign." "Meaning?" Meaning your evidence was heard. She sees what this is. Eleanor exhaled slowly. There was still a hearing to attend. Still questions to answer. Still an entire performance of concern to endure from the very people who had tried to steal her legacy before her body was even cold. But the tide was shifting. No longer was she the fragile matriarch. She was now something else entirely. She was a woman reclaiming her shape. That night, Eleanor made a list, not legal this time, but personal. I am not selfish for protecting my peace. I am not cold for creating distance. I am not broken because they left. I am not theirs to manage. I am not afraid. She folded the list and tucked it inside her journal next to the hospital notes. It wasn't triumph she felt, not yet, but it was the beginning of something far more important. It was the beginning of freedom. Part 8. Eleanor had never been one for dramatic entrances, and she wasn't about to start now, not even at her own guardianship hearing. On the morning of the court date, she arrived 30 minutes early, dressed in a navy wool coat and soft leather gloves, the same ensemble she used to wear when meeting donors for the retreat. It wasn't about appearances. It was about posture, how you carry yourself when others expect you to crumble. Nora was waiting on the courthouse steps, a neat stack of documents in her briefcase, and an expression that said she had done this many times before. But when she looked at Eleanor, her face softened. "You ready?" she asked. Eleanor adjusted her coat. "More than I thought I'd be." They walked in together, silently, passing families with real emergencies. Guardianships involving dementia, addiction, abuse. Eleanor could feel the difference in the air. This wasn't a rescue. It was a hostile acquisition. Inside the courtroom, Malcolm was already seated at the petitioner's table, flanked by his attorney, a young man with an expensive haircut and smug expression. Heather sat beside them, flipping through her phone. Rachel was near the back, not with them, not quite apart either. None of them looked at Eleanor when she entered, and she didn't look for their eyes. The judge, a woman with salt and pepper hair and a face like weathered marble, called the session to order. "Petition for emergency guardianship of Eleanor Hawthorne," she read aloud, "filed by Malcolm Hawthorne, supported by Heather and Rachel Hawthorne." She looked at Eleanor directly. "Mrs. Hawthorne, do you understand the nature of this petition?" "Yes, Your Honor," Eleanor replied, voice steady. "Do you have representation?" "I do," Eleanor said, nodding to Nora. Malcolm's lawyer rose first. "Your Honor, the petitioners are simply acting out of love and concern. Mrs. Hawthorne has experienced a serious cardiac event, during which she appeared disoriented, vulnerable, and, according to multiple witnesses, unwilling or unable to engage in clear financial decision-making." Eleanor stared ahead, not blinking. "Furthermore," the lawyer continued, "her recent transfer of a multi-million-dollar property to an unknown nonprofit raises serious concerns about undue influence, impaired judgment, and the potential mismanagement of family assets." Nora stood, calm, composed. "Your Honor, we have no objection to the petition being heard in full, but we believe the evidence will show not confusion but clarity, not mismanagement, but intentional legacy planning. My client is not only mentally sound, but legally protected. We will submit documents confirming the retreat's full and lawful transfer into an independently governed nonprofit trust, along with hospital records showing she was lucid and recovering at the time of the incident referenced." She handed the judge a thick folder of evidence. "And," Nora added, "we have audio transcripts, journal entries, and eyewitness statements regarding the attempt made to coerce a signature while my client was sedated in the ICU." That caused a ripple in the room. Even Rachel looked up. The judge raised a brow. You're saying the petitioners brought legal documents into a hospital room while the respondent was incapacitated? Yes, Your Honor, Nora said, with a notary present. No consent was given. The respondent remembers everything. The judge turned to Eleanor. Would you like to speak? Eleanor stood slowly. Her knees wobbled slightly, but her spine held tall. I built my life carefully, Your Honor, she began. I built Rosewood Glen from the ashes of my grief after my husband died. I didn't inherit it. I didn't buy it on a whim. I made it. Brick by brick. Woman by woman. She paused. My children believe that love means entitlement, that blood equals ownership. But I no longer believe that. I love them enough to raise them, feed them, clothe them, but I don't owe them my life's work. She looked at Malcolm now. Especially not when they tried to take it while I was unconscious. Silence filled the courtroom. The judge cleared her throat. I'll review all submitted materials. A written decision will be mailed. No rulings today. Nora helped Eleanor sit back down. Her heart was pounding, but her breath was even. Outside the courthouse, the wind had picked up. Clouds hovered low, but the rain hadn't started. Nora turned to her. Regardless of what that letter says, she said, you reclaimed your voice in there, and that's something no court can undo. Eleanor smiled faintly. I know. Back at home, she changed into her robe and lit the lavender candle Belinda had gifted her last winter. She didn't answer her phone. She didn't check her email. She made soup, lentils and sweet potatoes again, and sat at her small kitchen table in silence. 3 days passed. Then the envelope came. She didn't open it right away. She let it sit on the table beside her tea until the afternoon sun had faded behind the pines. When she finally read it, the words washed over her like warm water. Petition denied. No grounds for guardianship. Furthermore, the court finds reason to believe financial coercion may have occurred. This matter is being referred for separate civil inquiry. Eleanor didn't smile. She exhaled. A long, deep release. Later that day, she walked 2 blocks around her neighborhood. Children were playing hopscotch on the sidewalk. A golden retriever barked from behind a white picket fence. The world went on, indifferent and gentle. And for the first time in weeks, Eleanor felt intact. She had not been rescued. She had saved herself. Eleanor didn't celebrate. There were no champagne corks, no calls to announce the court's decision. She didn't even tell her neighbors. Instead, she folded the letter from the judge neatly, slid it into a manila folder labeled Legal, Guardianship, and placed it in the fireproof lockbox beside the trust paperwork. Then she made herself a cup of chamomile tea and sat quietly at the window, watching the trees sway gently outside. Her victory wasn't one of triumph. It was one of relief. The kind that sinks into your bones after months of bracing. The kind that makes you exhale without realizing you'd been holding your breath for so long. Still, Eleanor knew better than to assume it was over. 2 days after the ruling arrived, she received a message from the retreat's legal counsel. Malcolm had attempted to contact the board again, this time claiming he had unofficial authority to approve partnerships, citing verbal agreements that never existed. The message was short. He is not representing us. We've forwarded your documents to the full board. No further contact will be allowed without legal clearance. Eleanor responded with a simple directive. Ensure all staff are aware. No permissions come from my children. All communications go through the Foundation's board. Full stop. That night, as she sat in the kitchen sipping leftover broth, she looked out the back window, the same one where she used to watch Malcolm toss a football with his son. The same backyard where Heather once hosted her first engagement party, arranging finger sandwiches like a magazine spread. the same patch of dirt where Rachel once planted tomatoes and forgot to water them, then wept when they withered. She wasn't angry at those memories, but she no longer held onto them like lifelines. They were facts, not obligations. The following morning, Eleanor retrieved her leather-bound journal, the one that had followed her through every major life transition. She opened to a blank page and wrote, Wednesday, 6:12 a.m. They tried to erase me. I am still here. I remember the hospital. I remember the pen. I remember Rachel whispering, "It'll give you peace of mind." I remember that I did not sign. She sat in stillness for a moment, letting the words settle. Then she flipped the page and began another list. This one was different, more practical, but no less sacred. To prepare, finalize will updates, reinforce board policies, add security lighting on retreat property, request camera footage archive, notify lawyer to draft incapacity letter. That last item was important. Nora had already suggested it. A sealed document to be released only in the event of Eleanor's mental or physical incapacitation, outlining the full account of her children's legal maneuvers and explicitly denying them any authority. She wrote it that afternoon, by hand. 4 pages. Every word selected with care. She placed it in an envelope, wrote, "Only open if necessary," and gave it to Nora that same evening. Nora, in return, assured her it would be kept in a secure location with her firm. "There's something poetic about all this," Nora said as they sat in her office, the autumn light filtering through half-closed blinds. "Poetic?" Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "You didn't try to hold on to power," Nora said. "You let go. And that's what protected you." Eleanor gave a soft smile. Sometimes letting go is the most powerful act of all. Over the next few weeks, Eleanor busied herself not with battles, but with restoration. She cleared out the guest room, boxed up old linens, threw out cracked photo frames, donated piles of outdated books and unread cookbooks. She rearranged the pantry, reorganized her closet, removed Malcolm's spare key from the hook by the back door and changed the locks. It wasn't spite. It was clarity. Some ties aren't meant to be cut in fury, but in wisdom. She reached out to a local nonprofit that offered caregiver support and quietly sponsored 3 families for a full year. No announcement, no credit, no press. Just a simple note. In memory of all the things we quietly carry, a friend. Then came the invitation. Not from her children, but from the retreats board. An annual legacy dinner had already been on the calendar, scheduled before all the drama began. Originally, Malcolm had suggested it would be the perfect time to formally announce the transition of Rosewood Glen to the next generation. Eleanor had not canceled the event. She had simply rewritten it. She crossed off every family name on the guest list. No children, no heirs, no speeches about succession. Instead, she invited a retired nurse who had once been denied access to the retreat due to budget cuts, a middle school teacher who used to bring at-risk girls for weekend workshops, a women's shelter coordinator who had sent 4 unanswered emails before giving up. Each received a handwritten invitation. "You belong here. I'd be honored if you joined us." The RSVPs trickled in slowly, then steadily. One by one, people responded, some in disbelief, some with gratitude, many with stories of how Rosewood Glen had once touched their lives. One letter came from a woman named Sheila. "My sister came to your retreat 10 years ago. She never spoke much about what happened there, but she came home different, calmer, stronger. She passed last year, but I still remember how she smiled when she mentioned the garden. I'll come." For her, Eleanor read that note 3 times. She had made the right decision. She was no longer saving a legacy. She was returning it to where it belonged. 3 days before the legacy dinner, Eleanor heard a knock on the front door. It was the kind of knock that announced itself. Not rushed, not hesitant, just confident. She peeked through the curtains. Malcolm, alone, standing at the edge of the porch in a pressed jacket, his hands buried deep in his coat pockets. He wasn't holding flowers or even an apology, just standing, waiting. As if this were still his mother's house, and not the place he'd tried to seize. Eleanor didn't rush. She didn't fix her hair or adjust her cardigan. She opened the door slowly, stepping aside just enough so she could see him fully and be seen. He spoke first. "We need to talk." She nodded once, then stepped back into the living room. She didn't offer coffee, didn't motion toward the couch. He followed her in but didn't sit. He glanced around the room like he was taking inventory again, just like he had in the ICU. "You're really going through with this?" Eleanor folded her hands over her lap. "I already have." His jaw tightened. "You're throwing everything away." "No," she said softly. "I'm giving it back. To the people who actually need it." Malcolm stared at her. "We could have worked something out. You didn't have to cut us off. We were trying to help." "Help?" Her voice didn't rise, but it grew firmer. "You brought a notary into a hospital room, Malcolm. You tried to get me to sign away everything while I was sedated. You were declining. We didn't know how bad it was going to get." Eleanor shook her head slowly. "You didn't come with care. You came with paperwork." He exhaled, rubbed the back of his neck, and began pacing the room like he used to as a teenager after being caught in a lie. "You've made it clear," he said at last. "There's nothing left for us when this is over." She met his gaze. "That's the point." He stopped walking. She continued, voice calm. "I spent my whole life building something that wasn't meant to become a family inheritance. It was meant to serve, to comfort, to lift women who had lost everything. It was never supposed to become your next investment." Malcolm didn't respond. He just stood there, breathing through his nose like a man trying to stay composed. "You were supposed to inherit the love I showed you," Eleanor added, "not the land beneath my feet." Finally, he broke the silence. "You won't have anything left for us." Eleanor tilted her head. "You say that like it's a threat. It's a warning." "No," she said, standing slowly. "It's freedom." She walked to the door and opened it wide. Malcolm didn't move at first. Then he walked past her, still not meeting her eyes. At the threshold, he paused. "You think you're noble, but someday you'll regret pushing us out." She didn't answer, because she didn't believe that anymore. When the door clicked shut behind him, Eleanor locked it, gently, decisively. Not as an act of fear, but one of finality. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was clean. She stood in it for a while, letting it settle over her like a blanket. Then she returned to the kitchen and poured herself a glass of water. Her hands trembled, not from confrontation, but from release. For the first time in years, there was nothing left to brace for. The night of the legacy dinner arrived without fanfare. The staff at the retreat had spent the day stringing soft lights through the trees and setting up long tables under the glass house dome. White linens, mason jars filled with candles. Simple, elegant, unassuming. At 5 p.m., the sun began to dip low, brushing the sky with warm streaks of amber and rose. Guests began to arrive, quietly, respectfully. A woman with silver hair and a floral shawl stepped out of a rusted sedan, holding the hand of a boy who couldn't have been more than 5. A retired postal worker in uniform. A woman in a wheelchair, her teenage granddaughter pushing her slowly down the gravel path. None of them wore expensive shoes. None of them arrived with expectations, and yet they belonged. Eleanor stood by the entrance, wearing a dress she hadn't worn in years, a deep navy piece with slightly frayed cuffs. It was the same one she wore on the opening day of Rosewood Glen, decades ago. Back then, she'd been nervous, uncertain, full of questions. Tonight, she was still. At each place setting, she had left a handwritten note. "You belong here." That's all it said. When the last guest had arrived and the light dimmed fully into dusk, Eleanor stepped up to the small microphone near the front of the glass house. She didn't prepare a speech. She didn't need to. "I just want to say thank you," she began, her voice soft but clear. "Not for showing up tonight, but for being part of this place's heart, whether it was 10 years ago or tonight. Rosewood Glen was never meant to be a business. It was meant to be a balm, a safe haven for anyone carrying too much." She took a breath. "This land, this building, this community, it doesn't belong to me anymore. And it doesn't belong to any bloodline. It belongs to you, all of you. The transfer is complete. There's no inheritance, no reversal. Only what we create together, moving forward." There was a long pause. Then slowly people stood, not in applause, not in ceremony, just standing, some with tears, some with soft smiles, most just quiet. Eleanor stepped back from the mic and let the moment breathe. The candles flickered. Someone laughed, someone cried. Dinner was served. And for the first time in a long, long while, Eleanor didn't feel like she was guarding something. She felt like she was sharing it. By the time the last candle burned down and the final guest had departed, Eleanor remained in the garden, standing barefoot on the dewy grass. The sky was a deep shade of navy now, speckled with stars that barely pierced the veil of autumn haze. She let the cool air settle into her skin, wrapping her arms around herself. Not from cold, but from awe. Something had shifted, not in the world, but in her. She walked the length of the retreat ground slowly, like saying goodbye to a version of herself that no longer needed to cling to control. The meditation nook under the oaks, the bench overlooking the lake, the gazebo where Belinda once wept after reading her late husband's last letter. Eleanor touched each space gently, like blessing a memory. By midnight, she returned home. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke and lavender. Her feet ached, but her spirit was light, too light for the weight she had carried just weeks before. She stepped into the kitchen, kicked off her shoes, and found something taped to the counter. A small envelope. No name. Just a piece of notebook paper, folded into thirds. Eleanor opened it slowly. It was Heather's handwriting. "I didn't understand. I still don't. But I'm sorry." There was no demand, no explanation, no defense, just a single sentence that felt, oddly, like a sigh. Eleanor stood there, reading it over and over, not because she needed to believe it, but because, for the first time in months, it didn't hurt to read her daughter's words. She didn't cry. She didn't crumble. She placed the note gently in the drawer beside the stove. Not out of forgiveness, but because it no longer needed to live in her hands. That was the beginning of something unexpected. Not reconciliation, not healing, not yet, but release. And sometimes, that was enough. About a week after the dinner, Eleanor received a letter forwarded from the retreat's temporary office. There was no return address, just a slanted, sharp handwriting she hadn't seen in years. It was from Grant, her nephew, her late sister's only child. He drifted from the family years ago, always floating between jobs, towns, relationships. He rarely attended holidays, never returned phone calls. Still, Eleanor had once helped him pay for community college and had kept a framed photo of him as a boy on her hallway bookshelf, long after he'd stopped sending Christmas cards. She hadn't expected to hear from him now. Evelyn. I drove past the retreat last week, saw people walking freely through the gates. I pulled over and just sat there watching. I saw a woman in a wheelchair being pushed by her daughter. I remembered her. Well, not her, but someone like her from years ago. From a memory I didn't even know I had. I didn't write to ask for anything. I just wanted to say I understand now. Not why you did it, but that you had the right to. There was no return address, no phone number, just those words. Eleanor folded the letter carefully, almost reverently, and placed it in the same drawer as Heather's note. This time, not out of nostalgia, but because it felt safe to hold them together. That afternoon she made herself a grilled cheese and tomato soup and ate by the window. She saw a couple walking their dog, bundled in coats, hands brushing but not quite holding. A little girl in a red scarf dragged a stick through the dirt along the sidewalk. A delivery truck passed, tires crunching leaves as it turned the corner. Nothing grand, just life. Later, she walked the long gravel path toward the bench by the retreat garden, her favorite place to sit before workshops. Years ago, she used to wait there for the first guests to arrive. She remembered watching the nervous ones hesitate before stepping through the gate, unsure if healing could even be possible. Now, she saw it differently. Healing didn't begin in the big rooms. It started in moments like these, quiet ones, when no one's watching. She sat on the bench and closed her eyes. The air carried the scent of distant pine and dry leaves. A man tied a scarf around his wife's neck as they passed by, and she smiled at him without saying a word. There was no fanfare, no declaration, no recognition, just belonging. That evening Eleanor called Belinda. They hadn't spoken since the dinner, both too emotionally spent to rehash it. But Belinda answered immediately, her voice lower than usual. "I wasn't sure if I should call first," she said. "I wasn't either," Eleanor replied. "But I wanted to tell you something." She told her about the note from Heather, the letter from Grant, the silence that no longer felt threatening. Belinda didn't respond right away. Then she said, "I've seen something shift in Rachel too. I ran into her at the market last week. She didn't say much, but she didn't look angry, just tired, like someone who finally realizes a door is closed." Eleanor nodded. "Maybe that's all I needed. Not an apology, just space." "Sometimes that's all we get," Belinda said gently. "Not closure, not healing, just a little more room to breathe." Eleanor smiled softly into the phone. And breathing is enough. After the call, she sat in the living room with a book she didn't open, the fire crackling quietly nearby. On the mantel was the old photograph of her and her husband, taken on the very first day they broke ground on Rosewood Glen. She looked at it now, not with longing, but with gratitude. Everything she'd protected, the land, the spirit, the story, it was still hers. Not to own, but to release. And now finally, she was free. Eleanor began visiting the retreat more often, not for business, not for oversight, but simply to be present. She no longer sat in the founder's chair during board meetings. She didn't offer input on programming schedules or menu changes. Instead, she quietly attended morning meditation circles, drank herbal tea in the communal kitchen, and smiled at strangers who no longer knew her name. And that was how she liked it. Rosewood Glen had taken on a life of its own. The space pulsed with a kind of calm that couldn't be faked, a soft confidence that only came from true community. The staff were younger now, more diverse, more fearless in their ideas. There were workshops on grief, yes, but also on rediscovery, self-trust, and even creative rage. Women came not just to mourn, but to begin again. One afternoon, Eleanor wandered into the pottery studio, a room she'd walked past 100 times but never entered. Inside, a small group of women shaped clay into bowls and vases, their hands moving slowly, deliberately. Joyce, one of the newer residents, sat at the front, her silver braid tucked over one shoulder. She was teaching the session, though she never called it that. "We don't do therapy in here," she'd once said with a grin. "We just shape what we've carried too long." Eleanor didn't sit. She just stood by the door and watched as laughter floated gently across the room, mingling with the rhythmic sound of wheels turning and water splashing. It was beautiful in its simplicity. Later that day, Eleanor walked the wooded path behind the main house. The leaves had turned deep gold and burgundy, the scent of damp earth thick in the air. She paused near the small stone bench that overlooked the quietest part of the lake. Someone had recently etched words into it, neatly, intentionally. "No one can give you your voice back. You take it when you're ready." She traced the letters with her finger and blinked slowly. She didn't know who had written it or when, but it felt as if the stone itself had been waiting for her to find it. That night, she sat by the window in her bedroom, sipping a warm mug of cinnamon tea. The air was still. Inside, the fire crackled faintly, and her journal lay open on her lap. She didn't write much, just a single line. They tried to write the ending, but the story is still mine. Her home had never felt this quiet, not empty, but uncluttered. The noise of old arguments, the echo of what-ifs, the tension of waiting for a knock that never came, gone. What remained was space, and with that space came clarity. She pulled open the drawer of her bedside table and took out the letter Grant had sent, the one without a return address. She unfolded it slowly and read it again. Not for answers, but for witnessing. The acknowledgement in his words mattered more than any apology. She slid it into the back of her new journal, one she'd started not to document loss, but to rediscover herself outside of family, outside of legacy, outside of expectation. The story of Eleanor Hawthorne was still unfolding, and this time, it didn't need approval. A few days later, Eleanor received a voicemail from Rachel. It was short, measured. "Hi, Mom. I won't pretend everything's fine. It's not. But I hope you're okay. I really do." Eleanor didn't return the call, not out of spite, but because she no longer moved from guilt. Instead, she whispered into the silence, "I hope you're okay too." And that felt enough for now. The next morning, she walked to the community room again, not to speak, just to sit. A woman was telling her story. She had recently left a 30-year marriage. Her children refused to speak to her. She wasn't sure she'd done the right thing. "But I'm learning," the woman said, "to not let the silence define me, to sit with it, to let it become something less frightening." Eleanor didn't say anything, but when the woman looked her way, their eyes met. And Eleanor nodded, just once. The woman nodded back. That moment passed without applause, without validation, but it meant everything. Snow came early that year. It drifted over the retreat grounds like powdered sugar, softening the sharp edges of the fences and rooftops. Eleanor stood on her back porch that morning, wrapped in a knit shawl, her mug steaming against the crisp air. The lake was beginning to freeze at the edges. Pine branches bent gently under the weight of white. Inside, she had no emails to return, no calendars to organize, no papers to sign, just the quiet pulse of a Sunday morning and the warmth of something she hadn't felt in years. Peace. It wasn't perfection. There were still echoes, ghosts of past words, glances that stung, silences that spoke louder than screams. but they passed through now like wind beneath a door, felt, but no longer feared. On the counter was an invitation from Joyce. She had started offering beginner classes for seniors who wanted to try pottery for the first time. At the bottom of the invite was a small handwritten note. "It's not about the shape. It's about the hands that shape it." Eleanor didn't sign up for the class, but that afternoon she walked over just to watch through the window. Inside, women were laughing, clay smudged on their cheeks, aprons, hands. One woman had tears in her eyes as she placed a small bowl on the shelf to dry. Eleanor didn't need to speak. She didn't need to teach. She just stood outside, coat wrapped tight, heart lighter than it had been in decades. She turned back toward the path, her boots crunching through thin layers of snow, and felt her breath rise into the cold air, visible, solid, hers. For the first time she realized, this wasn't the ending. It was after. And sometimes after is where the true story begins. Eleanor didn't mark anniversaries anymore, not in the way she used to. Birthdays, holidays, even the anniversary of the retreat's founding, all passed quietly, with a candle lit or a pot of tea brewed just a little stronger. The events that once called for elaborate gatherings now served as quiet reminders. You are still here, and that is enough. But this morning felt different. As she stirred oatmeal on the stovetop, the soft scrape of the wooden spoon against the pan reminded her of a time, years ago, when Malcolm had sat at this very table, helping his son with spelling homework. Heather had been making scones in the oven, and Rachel had curled up on the couch under one of Eleanor's hand-knitted throws. It had been a rainy Sunday, the kind that forces everyone to slow down and be still. She missed that. Not the illusion of harmony, but the realness of it, before ambition crept in, before the family became a structure of negotiations rather than connection. And yet, she didn't wish to go back. Not really. The woman she had become, who had endured betrayal, reclaimed her name, and preserved her purpose, was stronger than the one who used to bake scones for ungrateful guests. She poured the oatmeal into a ceramic bowl, one she had purchased from the retreat's pottery studio just last week. Joyce had made it, slightly lopsided, with a thumbprint near the rim. Perfect in its imperfection. Eleanor carried it to the dining table and sat alone. The snow outside had begun to melt, revealing patches of stubborn grass and the first signs of crocus buds. Winter was loosening its grip. So was she. Later that day, she visited the retreat grounds again, this time bringing a small cardboard box labeled simply, "To let go." Inside were items she no longer needed, old business cards with her former title, notebooks filled with outdated staff meeting notes, the printed retreat menus she once spent hours obsessing over. She walked them into the office, greeted Lila, and smiled. "I'd like to leave these with you." Lila looked down at the box and then back up. "Are you sure?" "I don't need them to remember what this place means." Lila nodded. "Would you like us to archive them in the foundation files?" Eleanor paused, then shook her head. "Number toss what you don't need. Use the box for clay. Let it be part of something else now." She turned and left before emotion could catch in her throat. That evening, as she settled into her reading chair with a blanket over her knees, the doorbell rang. She hesitated, then rose to check the window. Rachel. No banana bread this time. No dramatic stares through the glass. Just her. She looked different, paler somehow, her eyes softer. Eleanor opened the door without a word. "Hi, Mom," Rachel said. Eleanor nodded once. "Would you like to come in?" "I don't want to stay long," Rachel replied. I found something." She pulled a folded piece of paper from her coat pocket. "It's an old letter you wrote me. I found it in a shoebox in my closet last week. Eleanor took it gently. She didn't open it. She didn't need to. I'd forgotten how kind your words were, Rachel continued, her voice faltering. I just wanted you to know. I remember now what it felt like to be loved that way. Eleanor's heart ached in a way she hadn't expected. Not in sorrow, but in mourning for the time lost between them. Thank you, she said simply. Rachel nodded and stepped back, as if unsure whether she was allowed to linger. Then she added, I'm sorry for standing beside Malcolm instead of standing up. Eleanor looked her daughter in the eye. Thank you for not pretending it didn't happen. Rachel gave a small, sad smile. I'm trying to learn how to sit with silence without needing it to be filled. That's a good place to start. They stood there for a moment longer. Two women with decades of history between them, and no need to summarize it all in a single visit. Rachel turned to go. I'll come back, when it's okay. Eleanor didn't say yes, but she didn't say no either. That night, Eleanor lit the fireplace and opened the letter Rachel had returned. It was dated nearly 15 years ago. Her handwriting was a bit looser then, still elegant, still steady. Dear Rachel, I know the world will try to tell you who to be, but I hope you'll remember that you're already someone beautiful, just as you are. Even if you forget, I won't. She folded the letter and placed it in her journal, pressing it between the pages of her most recent entry. March 3rd. The snow is melting. My daughter came back. I don't know what will grow next, but I'll stay long enough to see it bloom. She closed the journal and exhaled deeply. There were still so many unanswered questions. Would she ever forgive them fully? Would they ever see her not as a matriarch to manage, but as a person who had always been whole? She didn't know, but she had let go of needing to know. And in that letting go, she had found something rare and holy, peace without permission. Spring didn't arrive in a single breath. It crept in, subtle and quiet. The snow receded inch by inch. Rain replaced frost. Tree branches once bare began to bud with a quiet kind of confidence, like the land itself had decided to begin again, without apology or announcement. Eleanor noticed the changes first through the windows. Longer light in the afternoons, birdsong before her alarm. Then she noticed it in herself. She no longer double-checked the locks at night. She no longer watched the road for unexpected cars. The fear had unraveled, thread by thread, until all that remained was stillness. Not a performance of strength, but a return to it. One morning she walked to the post office on foot. It had been months since she'd done that. She took the long route, past the lake, then through the edge of the woods where daffodils now poked through the softened soil. When she returned home, she carried only one envelope, no return address. But the handwriting was unmistakable. Malcolm's. She stood in her kitchen for a long time before opening it. Not because she feared the contents, but because she no longer felt the urge to brace. Inside was a simple card. Plain cream paper, black ink. His handwriting had grown smaller, tighter. Mom, I've been thinking a lot about what I said, about what I tried to take. I still don't agree with how you did things. But I can see now that you didn't owe us what we assumed was ours. I'm not asking for anything. I just wanted to say I'm sorry. M. There was no signature, no return address, just that letter. Eleanor didn't cry. She didn't crumple it up. She placed it beside Rachel's note, beside Heather's quiet apology, and folded them all into a new file labeled Unfinished Things. Not because she needed closure, but because she had stopped waiting for it. A week later, she stood at the edge of the community garden, watching a group of women plant seedlings into fresh soil. Tomatoes, basil, snapdragons. Lila waved from across the path, hands muddy, cheeks flushed with the effort of spring preparation. Eleanor waved back and remained where she stood. She didn't need to be in charge anymore. She didn't need to direct or organize. Her presence alone was enough. She had become a part of the place, like the soil, like the wind, something enduring and quiet. Joyce approached with a basket of gardening tools. "Need something to do?" she asked with a grin. Eleanor smiled. "Number just watching is good today." Joyce nodded and sat beside her on the wooden bench. They didn't speak for a while. The sounds of digging, laughter, and wind filled the silence. "You ever think you'd make it through all that?" Joyce asked gently. "No," Eleanor replied. "But I didn't think I'd lose them like that either." Joyce nodded. "Sometimes love doesn't survive power. But sometimes, after the power burns off, the love is still there." Eleanor turned to her. "Is that what you believe?" Joyce shrugged. "It's what I hope." They watched a young woman kneel beside her daughter, teaching her how to gently bury a seedling. "Funny," Eleanor whispered. "I spent years teaching women how to grieve, and it turns out I had to grieve my own children while I was still alive." Joyce placed a hand on Eleanor's. "Grief doesn't mean it's over. It means it's real." Eleanor didn't speak, but her hand didn't pull away either. That evening, Eleanor returned home and opened the notebook she'd started after her recovery. Most of it wasn't prose, just scattered thoughts, memories, moments she hadn't shared with anyone. She turned to a blank page and began to write. April 9th. My children are not the villains of my story. They are the product of the world we raised them in, where legacy became currency, where love became a ledger, and where silence covered discomfort like dust on old furniture. I do not excuse them, but I understand them. And I understand myself better now, too. She paused and looked out the window. A soft rain had begun to fall, tapping gently on the roof. She set down the pen and just listened. For so long, she'd filled her world with explanations, defenses, stories told to justify or protect. Now, she wanted only truth. And the truth was this. She was still here. Whole, undiminished, free. 2 days later, she received a call from the retreat's current board chair. They were planning to name the newly renovated garden after her. She declined. "Name it after the first woman who came here and stayed," she said. "The one who didn't think she deserved peace, but learned to grow something anyway." The chair paused. "Do you know her name?" "No," Eleanor smiled. "And that's why it's perfect." Spring deepened. Eleanor bought a new watering can. She replanted the front flower bed with marigolds and rosemary. She read 3 novels in 1 week and started baking again, just for herself. Peach cobbler, cinnamon rolls, and an old carrot cake recipe from a church newsletter she found tucked in a drawer. Each small act reminded her of something she had forgotten in all the fighting, the loss, the courtrooms, and whispered betrayals. That she liked her life, not the version her children saw, not the one donors celebrated, just the quiet, simple rhythm of waking up, putting on soft clothes, and choosing what mattered. Every day that choice became easier. Every day she felt less like a survivor of something painful, and more like a woman who had rewritten her own ending. The day began like any other. Eleanor woke just before sunrise, her bones a little stiff, her breath steady. She brewed a pot of Earl Grey, buttered a slice of toast, and sat on her porch wrapped in her favorite cardigan. The morning fog had not yet lifted from the lake, and a hush hung in the air, the kind that made everything feel sacred. It had been 6 months since the guardianship hearing. 4 since the legacy dinner. In that time, the retreat had blossomed under its new leadership, and Eleanor had quietly stepped further into the background. Less founder, more witness. There were days she felt the ache of distance, the ache of what her children once were, or what she had once imagined they would be. But that ache no longer owned her. It was part of her, but it didn't define her. That was the difference. As she finished her tea, the phone rang. It was Belinda. "I've got something for you," she said. "Meet me at the garden." Eleanor changed into her walking shoes, tucked a scarf around her neck, and made the familiar trek to the retreat. The gravel path was dry, the trees alive with birdsong. When she arrived, Belinda was standing near the bench by the lake, holding a thin wooden plaque. "What's this?" Eleanor asked. Belinda handed it to her. It read, "The place she protected. For the one who chose peace over possession." Eleanor read the inscription, then ran her fingers gently across the engraving. It was simple, unassuming, just like she wanted. "It's not a monument," Belinda said. "It's a reminder." Eleanor didn't speak. She simply nodded and handed it back. "Put it somewhere the sun reaches in the morning," she said. Belinda smiled and carried it toward the far edge of the garden where wildflowers were beginning to bloom. That afternoon, Eleanor stopped by the pottery room again. Joyce was glazing new mugs. The smell of warm clay and peppermint oil hung in the air. "Ready to make something?" Joyce teased. Eleanor smiled. "Not yet." She wandered the room for a few minutes, then paused at a shelf of finished pieces. Her fingers landed on a small, uneven bowl with a deep indigo swirl at the center. It wasn't perfect, but it was beautiful. She purchased it and carried it home in both hands, as if it were a fragile secret. That evening, she placed it in the center of her kitchen table and filled it with lemons from a neighbor's tree. The sight of it made her smile. Some things don't need to be grand to be meaningful. The next day brought another letter, this time from a woman Eleanor didn't know. A former guest of the retreat. "You won't remember me. I came 7 years ago after my husband left me for someone younger. I didn't speak to anyone the entire first day. I thought I was too old to start over, too bitter to be softened. But on the second morning, I found a note in my room that said, 'You're allowed to begin again.' I don't know if it was you, but I've carried that note in my wallet ever since. I saw your name in the local paper and just wanted to say, thank you." Eleanor folded the letter slowly and placed it in a new envelope marked Keep. She added it to the growing stack in her bedroom drawer, a quiet archive of lives touched, none of them asked for, none of them owed. She no longer questioned whether her life had mattered. It had, quietly, deeply. And that was enough. Later that week, Eleanor joined a small discussion circle at the retreat. Not as a speaker, just as a woman sitting in a chair with her hands folded over her lap. The group was sharing moments of letting go, stories of endings that didn't come with applause. One woman had left her home of 30 years. Another had cut ties with a sister who never offered love without a price. When it was Eleanor's turn, she didn't tell the whole story. She simply said, "I gave something away that everyone thought I should keep, and somehow, in doing that, I got more back than I ever expected." There was a pause. Then someone said softly, "That's brave." Eleanor shook her head. It wasn't bravery, it was clarity. They nodded, and that was that. On the first warm day of May, Eleanor hosted tea on her porch. Just a few neighbors, Belinda and Joyce. They brought scones, jam, and stories. The laughter came easily, the quiet even easier. As the afternoon sun dipped below the treetops, Joyce raised her cup and said, To the woman who taught us that legacy isn't what you leave behind. It's what you protect while you're still here. Eleanor felt her throat tighten, but she said nothing. She simply touched her cup to Joyce's and held it there, steady. That night, she journaled one last page in the notebook she had started the day she returned from the hospital, May 10th. I am no longer waiting for their apology. I am no longer explaining my decisions. I have let go of the door they closed and walked into a garden I opened. I am not done living, but I am done justifying. This is peace, and it's mine. She closed the notebook and placed it on the shelf beside her favorite poetry collection. Not because the story was over, but because the telling had brought her full circle. Eleanor Hawthorne's story is not one of dramatic victories or public applause. It is the quiet, powerful arc of a woman who chose peace over possession, clarity over comfort, and legacy over loyalty. Faced with betrayal from her own children, who tried to seize control of her estate in a moment of vulnerability, Eleanor had already made a choice they never expected. She had given it away. Not to punish them, but to protect the spirit of what she had built. Over time, Eleanor reclaimed her voice, not through confrontation, but through grounded acts of self-respect. She faced her children's legal challenge, endured the pain of familial estrangement, and withstood the loneliness that follows hard boundaries. But through that journey, she emerged as someone whole. She found comfort not in reclaiming relationships, but in redefining herself outside of them. Through simple rituals, making soup, writing letters, tending a garden, she learned that healing doesn't come from being saved, but from choosing oneself over and over again. The retreat she built, Rosewood Glen, became more than a sanctuary for others. It became the place where she herself returned to belonging. In the end, the message is clear. You are allowed to begin again. You are allowed to protect your story. You are allowed to let go. Not out of bitterness, but out of love for yourself. Eleanor did not wait for permission. She gave herself peace, and in doing so gave others permission to do the same.